morning, everyone, all of our listeners this morning, everyone who's tuned into this Axiom webinar. What we've decided to do is to launch a separate channel within the Axiom family, and we're referring to it as On the Brink, which is of course my surname, a play on my surname. But really the idea is to from a position of being absolutely in the market, as a business in the market, to take views forward. And these views are, how do we get to actually look at who business people are that make our world what it is? That it's not just this subclass of people, just this sort of privileged bunch of people who sort of make business work, but that really it's people making decisions every single day, and with every decision there's a trade-off. So here on the Brink, we honor the free thinkers, the influential individuals, gifted peers and change agents in our economy, in our society. We humanize these leaders. They're not just people who sort of happened. They made decisions, they have families, they have thoughts. They're wrong sometimes, often, and those wrong decisions have impact. And so we like to get to the bottom of that, to learn the real lessons. What defines their life? What are their philosophies? What are their principles, their deep purpose? Because people are driven by purpose. So we try and humanize on the show those people, and we believe in free markets. I think that's critical. Free markets are critical to our successes. And today on the show, I have someone who I've known for quite some time, and I think it would be fair to say that he's my friend. Russell and I spoke together at a conference a couple of years ago, and then I think another one, and we sort of kept exchanging ideas. And today it's a great privilege to have him. He's an economist by nature or by training, but he's much more than that, and I'm sure that'll come out today. He's a founder of ETM Macro Advisors, an advisory business for professional investors. He's based in Cape Town, and he specializes in macro investment strategy, asset allocation, business cycles, inflation, deflation, country risk, political analysis. Really anything. You can have a discussion with Russell about most topics, and he'll be good to go. He's the co-author of When Money Destroys Nations, a book about Zimbabwe, and we're going to be talking about that a little bit today as well. A book about Zimbabwe's hyperinflation and economic collapse. Everybody's concerned about hyperinflation, inflation in these times that we're in. So Russell, welcome, and thank you for joining me today. It's so lucky to have you, over to you.
Great to be here, Andries. Thanks so much for organizing this, and I'm looking forward to a free ranging conversation. And I hope we can add some value to the listeners and the viewers here today. I hope we can draw out some good insights about a very, very complicated world at the moment.
Absolutely, the world it's mad. So to call it complicated is probably not a great statement from you first off, because complicated implies some sanity, and you can sort of deconstruct the system at this stage. It all seems to be madness. So we're going to stop the conversation right now, because Russell is clearly not up to it. Russell, no, that's nonsense. I'd like to ask you, recently, but not just recently, you haven't shied away from taking controversial stances. You've said stuff that other people would not say, and I have to say, and this is maybe a bit of social commentary, that many people are thinking, and I would say that almost all business people are thinking, and then you would actually say it. So I guess the question is, why would you do that? Is it good for business, or is it a belief system? Who are you?
Yeah, thanks, Andries. I think one's got to always have this mantra that not everything that is true needs to be said, all the time or at every instance. And I suppose some of my outspokenness in the past might have been a little bit hasty and sometimes inappropriately thought through. But at the end of the day, I think I value and have a strong commitment to what I believe to be the truth. I recognize that one's got to remain humble in that pursuit, and of course it's not always easy to know what the truth is. But when you see truth, it's generally good and it's generally beautiful, and therefore I think something that needs to be shared with the world and spoken about. So I think that's something that I value quite highly, and I suppose what I've done in my career is position myself in such a way that I am relatively less encumbered by, I suppose, institutional trappings in order to be able to say what I really believe. Of course, it's got to be said respectfully. It's got to be said with magnanimity. It's got to be, it's got to be communicated in a way where you appreciate that there are opposing views and that people come from different perspectives and but I think that, I've probably structured my career in such a way that I am able to express a bit more. Is it good for business? In the short term, perhaps not. And perhaps not in the long term either. But what I do value is carving out a particular space where certain clients really, really like that space. They value the honesty, that they value that we can have very, very realistic conversations about the world. So, in doing what I do, I advise professional investors. I don't care really to spend time, beating around the bush and sort of pretending that things are what they aren't. Or, I think for me, if I'm doing a job like this, I need to be able to have, full freedom to be as realistic and as truthful as I think I need to be with my clients, because at the end of the day, you invest in a real world. Reality doesn't really care about your theories. So I suppose that's my context, Andries. I do know that a lot of people have said to me, Russell, you say things that we think, but we can't say. To some degree, I think certain things that some other people could say that maybe I can't say. We all, at the end of the day, do work for someone, and there are sensitivities, across the corporate world. And I'm not saying that those are necessarily bad constraints. I think there's good, healthy constraints, institutional constraints on what can and should be said at certain times. It's not that speech or even free speech is a kind of free for all, say what you like at any time sort of notion. There's healthy constraints on that sort of stuff. So I think that's the context I come from, Andries.
Yeah, I think that's just it. I think free speech, which is unconstrained, is fundamentally not free. And I think that truth has to be discovered, and truth has to be discovered through debate. And that's maybe something where our modern society really sucks, because I think that with all the modern communication techniques and so on, we're really not forming good arguments that are founded in sound principles and then putting them out for debate. It's not like, it's bigoted to say that you just want to have an opinion and then that's the end of that. The very concept of thought, I'm always on about this, but the very concept of university is e pluribus unum, out of the many one. So out of many thoughts, a single thought. What's the essence, what's the quintessence of any matter? And that can only be achieved through debate. And what I would say about you is, you don't just throw around opinions, you actually write them down. And you write them down in ways that people can access and then sort of comment and sort of bring that university play about. And so you certainly, and I think that's why you have such a strong following as well, from a business perspective, because people know your word isn't final. It's just an opinion. It's well-founded. It's thought through. It is based on, an ideology which should be clear for everyone to follow. And that sort of makes it easy. So I want to ask you about that ideology. I mean, so you clearly very important to distinguish, but I would say you're definitely classical liberal, and certainly you sort of Austrian school of economics in terms of your economic theory. Tell me about that evolution, because that's not necessarily what's taught in the universities these days, is it?
Yeah, I think most people who go through a university, a conventional sort of modern schooling and university system, are by and large, going to get a very modernist take on epistemology, on truth, on science, and certainly on economics, which in the last 100 years, I would say, has taken on what we might call a very scientistic flavor, which is to say that, and it sounds compelling in our culture, but it's this notion that the data leads you,
right,
that the data that the data will lead you to the truth. The reality is that data never speaks for itself. It's always spoken for and interpreted through a particular set of presuppositions. And I think where economics has taken a really, really wrong turn down the path that wasn't initiated by John Maynard Keynes, but it preceded Keynes, but certainly was popularized and spread through his influential works, and has been propagated by many other thinkers in the last 100 years since then. Is this idea that we can crunch the numbers, that the data tell us everything we need to know. And what you find when you dig into Keynesian economics and this approach is the underlying sort of presuppositions and assumptions about how the world works, how humans behave, how reality exists are quite weak. They don't actually hold up. And they make some tremendous leaps in logic. So I think for me, it was coming out of that system quite naive to alternative ways of thinking.
right.
And I suppose to a degree that's a discredit to myself partly, but also to the university system of which I was a product. And then, quite early on in my career, a few years into my career, hitting the financial crisis in 2008, I started working formally as an economist probably 2005.
Right.
So I was still quite young when 2008 crisis hit, and really got a wake-up call about how little many of the experts understood about what was going on, including myself, and not being a particular expert at that early stage of my career. And I think just going on a journey. I'm someone who's not satisfied with bad explanations. I'm someone who's not satisfied with part explanations for phenomena. And so I think for me, I suppose it's maybe that I do have this desire for kind of lifelong learning, whether I've cultivated that consciously or maybe that's just something that I have. But I think this idea of lifelong learning is critical. Certainly in the job I do, it's essential. If I don't keep learning, I'll become irrelevant and be quite a pathetic sort of figure in what I try and do professionally. So one's got to keep learning. And the beauty of the modern world, of course, is that you can study permanently.
Yeah.
The one thing the information revolution has delivered us is just infinite resources to continue to learn, and to continue to understand the world. So I went on this path of really trying to figure out from good explanations for why things were happening. Right. Keynesians invoke animal spirits in people to explain the onset of a recession or a crisis. That's not a satisfactory explanation for me. It's a religious type explanation. It's a sort of mystic kind of explanation. It doesn't ground itself in causal reality. So that journey took me into the Austrian school, understanding the building blocks really of of human action, of how economies operate from the individual and from the ground up, rather than from the top down, which is very much what you get told at university. That, there is this thing called the economy. We'll explain it to you a little bit, but basically, once you get the basics, all you need to know is that it can be tweaked and fiddled and changed from the top down. And if we pump more money in, and if we lower interest rates, and if we put it into the models just right, we can spit out the outputs that we want. Just a very technocratic, ivory tower, unanchored way of thinking about the economy. So that, I suppose, was part of that journey, and with that journey comes an entire sort of epistemological journey about how you think about what's true, or how to arrive at truth in particular spheres. There's different ways of arriving at truth in different spheres of understanding. If you're talking metaphysical things, then there's a different set of epistemological approaches that one needs to take. If one's doing physical science, that's another kind of set of approaches. If one's doing social science, it differs slightly. There's sort of common threads through all those things, and probably the main common thread is that we approach everything with a presupposition. Nothing is value free. Everything, we interpret everything through a lens. How we establish that lens is one level up from how we seek truth, and that's a very, very big and interesting question, which we maybe don't want to go too far into today. But this really doesn't just, it's not just relevant for economics. It's really relevant for a wide range of fields and how we seek truth in those fields.
Right. I just want to tell our listeners that I see that there's already one question that's come out. We've got 90 minutes today, and that's fun. So we'll see how much of it we use, but I suspect it's going to be more than an hour. And we'll get practical soon, guys. So you can ask your practical questions as well, and we'll see if we can get through to those. But I want to. So I mean, okay. So you find the Austrian school, and I've read Hayek and a few and others. What resonates with you, and why? Because I mean, clearly it's just a framework. It's just a set of beliefs that sort of are fundamentally sound, but it's not necessarily the full and the whole truth. So we need to still continue to develop that, right? And we need to adapt it for current scenarios, which obviously the one we're in at the moment is
absolutely.
That's a shocker. So what resonates about Austrian school? What's the fundamentals?
I think, so I mean, just before I get into some of the details there, I think it's very important that when you say that you adhere to a particular school of thought, a particular framework of thought, if that framework in a, when it comes to, for example, a field like an academic field like economics, understanding something about the real world, if that framework presents itself as settled, unchanging, and rigid, one's got to be very, very careful. The healthiest part of the Austrian school tradition in economics is the part that's genuinely continuing to have real debates, real conjecture and back and forth about the nature of reality. I think every school of thought, no matter what, has those adherents that regard it as settled and no more discussion needs to take place. And I think that's unhealthy. At the same time, you've got to recognize truth for what it is, and certain principles don't change. There's nothing new under the sun in a number of areas, right? Human beings are the same today as they were, thousands of years ago. So I think that I would just state that as a background. And so practically speaking, that's one of the reasons why you have to keep learning, because the Austrian school is not a fixed set of beliefs. It's an evolving structure. Um, and ideas will be presented, and you may disagree with those ideas, and so it may be that what becomes accepted orthodoxy, let's say in the Austrian school,
Right.
I might only agree with 75% of that,
Yeah.
but still be comfortable enough on the main issues to call myself an Austrian school economist. So I think that's important. One's got to keep alive to good ideas.
And what are those main issues? Is it around entrepreneurship, the power of the individual, the effects of making decisions, the reality that distributed decision making, distributed trust is a much better model than a centrist model? Is that sort of central to the theme?
Yeah. So I mean, Austrian thinking starts from. I mean, the sort of simplest way to describe it would be that it's built on it's built on microeconomic foundations, which is to say it goes to a human being and it says,
right,
what is a human being like? How does a human being act? Do human beings do things in order to achieve certain ends that they desire? Yes. Do human beings try to make their circumstances better off today than they were yesterday? Yes. These are kind of universal, timeless human truths. From the axiom of action, as Austrians call it, from the fact that humans act purposefully with a consciousness to improve their material situations, or just to improve their well-being or their psychic well-being. That could include materialism. It could include a kind of spiritual well-being. It's not prescriptive in terms of what you pursue. And the Austrian school shouldn't be confused with an ethical system.
Right.
It's much more of a scientific inquiry as to how humans behave and the consequences and the laws that govern the reality of that behavior and how that behavior interacts with the physical real world that is characterized by scarcity. We don't just click our fingers and get a meal on the table. We have to go and actually create it. We have to go and find it from natural resources and cultivate it and so on. So that's the starting point. And from that starting point, you can start to deduce very, very useful economic insights from this basic starting point that humans act in a scarce world to try and improve their circumstances. And so, yes, as you start building up that inductive process, you start building out the theoretical framework of what constitutes the Austrian school, called the Austrian school because it was primarily pioneered by men from Austria who were from Vienna, but really is now a global school of thought. In many ways, you could call it the American school nowadays, because it's probably flourished the most in the United States, but certainly still has a very strong European anchoring. So that's the basis of that. Now from some of these basics, it's not obvious that from Austrian principles you can deduce, let's say, libertarian principles or some which becomes a sort of ethical political structure that you might fit on top of that. But what you do start to get from the Austrian school is a recognition of man's limitations in terms of what he can design as a central planner, how he can organize society. It's a framework that reminds us that we can make very, very big mistakes when we over centralize knowledge. So Hayek was big on the distribution of knowledge. Right. Ludwig von Mises was very big on the importance of private property and free trade in that private property to determine prices, because for him, prices were the key transmission of knowledge in a complex system. And once you have prices operating realistically, reflecting reality, this is the key thing. If prices reflect reality, we can behave in ways that accord with reality, and we can achieve our purposes with much greater success. So to get from A to B, to get from a present circumstance to an imagined or hoped for circumstance that I perceive to be realistically achievable. To navigate my way there, I need a world where reality is reflecting back to me as clearly as possible. If I'm in a world that's where prices are distorted by excessive government regulations, where I'm not allowed to discover the reality of what prices are saying to me, then I can't achieve those ends to which I'm going, or it's very difficult for me to achieve them, and therefore it costs me a lot more time and resource. And therefore, if that's true for everyone, we are poorer as a society. We might achieve the goal eventually, but it'll cost us way more and be way less efficient. So the distribution of knowledge, and knowledge disseminated or distributed through the pricing mechanism. And this was the great failure of the communist systems, is that their pricing mechanisms were completely irrational, completely arbitrary, based on political fiat, and not based on the reflective reality of scarcity. And so that's kind of where this starts to take you. Once you start to realize that we best try and organize society centrally with great caution, it doesn't mean there's no place for governance, for decisions that affect people beyond just the individual or the individual family. But when we do that, we need to understand the forces that are operating, the forces of complexity that are operating against us, that are telling us, be careful that you don't over-centralize these decisions, because you start distorting the picture for real human behavior. And once you start doing that, you create real problems. So I think that's a good way to kind of think about how Austrians think about the world and approach the world. You have counter to that, or opposed to that, you have the socialist, Marxist, kind of communist idea, which really isn't an economic philosophy at all. It's really a kind of quasi-religious political philosophy that sort of makes economic inferences on the basis of this ethical sort of system. But it's really no kind of economic science whatsoever. And as a result, wherever socialism is tried the most confidently, let's say, by its adherents, that's where you get the most devastation. So the more committed you are to a communist vision, to central planning, to price controls, to resource controls by a central planner, the more devastating the outcome for the country. And the most devastating we've seen in the last 100 or 200 years has been, mass death. Whereas a free market system, people might die in such a system because maybe there was a war, or maybe there was a leader who was genocidal of his own accord. But in a socialist system, people actually die from the deprivation that comes when you can't make rational decisions about how to manage resources and how to sustain yourself. And then what you get with something like Keynesianism, I'll finish my answer quickly now, but what you get with something like Keynesianism is it's trying to bridge the gap between outright communism and a sort of more sensible kind of market approach. So it says, okay, no, we agree communism is very bad, but we also believe that governments can fiddle with policy levers to make their societies prosperous, and they can print money as long as they don't print too much, and they can borrow lots of money because that'll then cause the economy to stabilize and so on. And the Austrian school, also drawing from the classical liberal economic tradition, or the classical economic tradition, really refutes all this, and that's why I'm quite a fan of Say's law, which really refutes the idea that you can spend your way out of a problem, and that governments can kind of spend countries out of a recession. We don't have to get into all the technicalities of that, but this is really how I think about the world.
So when we just entered into the lockdown, I thought I thought we were heading for recession, and I still believe that, actually. I think that we're in deep, deep trouble. The only hope is exactly what you mentioned, and that is that humans will act almost Adam Smith, Invisible Hand, like, they will act on in their own interest, and that's a good thing for all, essentially. And so when we entered the lockdown, I decided I'm going to read a couple of interesting books, and the first one I tried was Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath, so that I could see what does it mean when really there is a recession. What does a recession really mean? And it's not pretty. But the second one that I've read recently is, and I, to be honest, I can't imagine why the government of the day haven't scrapped this from the school curriculum. But my daughter is in grade 10, and her English book is 1984 from Orwell, of course. And so I read 1984 the past week or so. And man, it's uncanny, the amount of similarities that we see. Obviously, technology has played out differently than what Orwell foresaw it in 1948. It was amazing what he saw in terms of screens being able to read, emotions and things like that. But certainly the trend of the day, and how he was absolutely correct in saying how it actually plays out in what is an overt communist theory today. I think we are almost not overtly communist, but I'm beginning to wonder that the whole of the Western world, and South Africa is probably ahead in that, is becoming covertly a lot more communist than what we may actually think. And I think that this lockdown is actually a wonderful sensor for people to see what's actually going on. Because, the fact of the matter is that nobody wants to die. I think we can agree on that. As a human behavior, we don't, that's why I think in the Christian tradition, we say that the biggest sacrifice is to offer your life. So nobody wants to die. We want to stay alive. I think that's, a pretty fundamental truth. I think a further pretty fundamental truth is that we sort of want to care for ourselves. So we want to eat and sort of dress appropriately and have a job and have sort of, and if we rise to the sort of the next level, then we want that for our families as well. So that family nucleus then becomes the building block of life, and that's a good thing. What we've seen now is that in the name of not dying and centralized regulation, we can't serve our families anymore. We've got the restaurateurs out in force saying that this is absolutely not right, and it shouldn't continue, because what should we do? And what the state is saying is, oh, we care, and we've printed a lot of money for you and created a whole bunch of guarantees. What the state is not saying is that, what, our government wage bill is crazy, and we, we'll do in kind. We will also fire sort of, 20% of our people, because that's the amount of jobs that we're losing in the whole system. That part they're not saying. And so I think what people are naturally gravitating towards is that I can't live my life under these conditions, and this is not right. I don't think people can put it in a framework and say why it's not right. And I think there's the counter argument at the moment, which is, we want to save lives and we want to be safe. Be safe, don't get infected. And that's understandable, because, clearly nobody wants to be infected, nobody wants to die from the infection. And it's, there's let's say a higher chance than with a normal flu season that you may die, due to COVID. So that seems to be a fact. But I think that, and I want to link back to you now, because when this whole pandemic struck, you guys set up a independent, think tank. You call it the pandemics, the Panda, and you on real statistical analysis. So even though you've said earlier in your discussion that you don't believe that economics should be driven by data, you are clearly fundamentally data-driven person. Not driven, but I mean you understand fundamentally what the data means. So it's not like you're discounting data. You're reading from that, and I guess that for an Austrian that's natural, because you're looking for price discovery. You're looking for different ways to read different sensors, and price is an important one, but certainly data is one. So you set up pandemics. day one, the first report, you guys called this for what it is and saying all the models are wrong. You know, I think there was an article today that said that the Western Cape had 16 times more. Sorry, they needed, the first models that came out said that the Western Cape needed 16 times more beds in the lowest scenario than what they have today, and their beds are not half full today. Okay,
Yeah,
so
I think that's about right. I didn't want to cut your train of thought off there, Andries, but yeah, just to say that it's been a fascinating journey with pandemic data and analytics. Started by Nick Hudson. I was one of the early members of it. Nick Hudson is an actuary who lives in Cape Town. When you know, I think it's an important thing you've just raised. I just want to touch on it quickly. To say that you are data driven, it's a common way of saying that you are evidence based, or you use data to try and understand the world. I mean, I think anyone does. I don't think anyone would not say that information, which is data, is how we understand what's going on in the world. But I think what's critical is that when you're using data, you're using it very judiciously, very cautiously, and it's just that you understand, and that everyone understands, that it's always looked at through a particular lens or a particular prism. I mean, a good example at the moment is when people talk about excess deaths from coronavirus. So there's a thing going on where people are saying, look, based on the last 5 years at this time of year, we would have expected to get X amount of deaths, let's say in June.
Right.
But hang on, in June we actually got, X plus something. And so if that plus something is more than the official corona deaths that have been reported, some people interpret that as saying we're undercounting corona deaths. We're undercounting coronavirus deaths. But another explanation is that lockdown is contributing to more deaths because we've got untreated cancers or TB or other things. Now, it doesn't mean that second explanation is definitely correct either, but it just shows you that just looking at numbers on the surface doesn't give you enough. You have to have a hypothesis. And yes, you want to be able to test that hypothesis. It should be a testable hypothesis, and it should be something that you can then accept or reject, or accept provisionally or reject provisionally. But, so I think that it's important that, so I'm very quantitative in the work that I do for my clients. I almost feel like I spend my life in data. But it's very, very critical to note that I'm spending my life in data, interpreting it from a particular theoretical perspective. Now, that theoretical perspective, as I said earlier, is constantly being refined and tweaked and improved. It's not a static thing. The core of it may change very seldom or never, but you're always just evolving that, and that's what it means to learn through life, right? You refine your hypotheses and your ways of thinking about the world, but it's critical that you have that prism to interpret the data. If you don't have anything, if you don't have any anchor through which to see the data that the world produces for you, you're going to be a very confused person about what you're seeing. You're going to be confused about causality. You're going to be confused about what's actually going on around you. And you do find even certain economists, they've never quite grasped that they need a strong anchor, that they need a strong prism. And so they jump around and they're quite inconsistent. You're never quite sure what you're going to get from them. What do they think about this? What do they think about that? What my clients love about me is that they're getting a consistent interpretation of what the world is feeding to us in terms of data. And I think the same must be true for pandemics. The same must be true for epidemiology, for virology. One's got to have sound explanations and sound hypotheses for what you're seeing. It can't just be, and I think that's probably what's happened in this whole crisis, is that we've had a flood of data hitting us on Twitter and on social media and on news broadcasts, and this guy said this and this guy said that. And what are we doing with that data? No one receiving that data, many people who receive that information don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to interpret it. They don't have a framework of how to think about it. What is our virological or epidemiological framework for interpreting any of this stuff? And so that's critical that there's that framework to interpret the data. I just wanted to make that super clear, because I think when it comes to science, when it comes to scientific debate, this is a nuance and an important nuance that has been largely forgotten, largely lost. And so what happens is, I'll just finish this little bit by saying this, what happens is you get epidemiological models that have predicted, millions and millions of deaths, 2 million deaths in America and 500,000 deaths in the UK and 350,000 deaths in South Africa. Those models were not based on good explanations of how the world works. They were based on very speculative assumptions about how humans might behave and about how a virus might spread. And those particular assumptions, the model is very sensitive to them. If you change those assumptions slightly, you get very, very, very different outputs. That is so we built models that were very flimsy, that were very assumption driven. Those assumptions didn't have a strong anchor. And as it happens, they've proved to be very, very wrong, very, very wrong assumptions.
Yeah,
now,
are you being kind?
Yeah. But let me just say that
if a business ever got it that wrong, they'd be out of business.
Well, yeah, exactly.
Now,
and I think
businesses are out of business, but
yeah,
but
no.
I mean, make that call.
But what I would like to say about this is that someone at UCT can build a model, and the model can show something, and maybe it's very wrong, and that doesn't bother me that much. People build models, they play with spreadsheets, and they make abstractions about the world. That's fine. I do that myself. Sometimes I see if I can figure something out in a spreadsheet. The difference is, I don't use my spreadsheet to get the government to tell 60 million people how to live their lives. That's a big difference. If I build something, I test it in the marketplace. If it fails in the marketplace, I lose revenue. So you said something interesting earlier. You said, when you're speaking about the sort of your values, you're saying free markets are how we have success, or part of how we achieve success. The beauty of free markets is they're also how we achieve failure. And markets allow us to achieve failure, to fail quickly, to reconstitute how we how we think about reality. An entrepreneur might believe that people are willing to buy his product. That's a belief about the world. But maybe he doesn't sell any. So his belief was wrong. And the market tells him that very quickly. The truth is delivered, if you like, in love back to him.
Well, it doesn't always feel like that.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. It's great. It's good truth, right?
Yeah.
And what we've got with the, let's call it the academic government complex. You see this in economics, and you see it, I think, in climate science, and I think you're seeing it now with epidemiology. Is you've got very little real world feedback loops on mistakes. There's going to be, I think, very little accountability, at least in the short term, for governments and for epidemiologists who made such bad models. And again, I just want to reiterate, my concern is not that people get models wrong. That happens to everyone. Models are always wrong, as they say. Yes, it's the quantum of how wrong they were, but it's when you take that kind of speculative activity, modeling activity, making very, very flimsy conjectures about the future, and you translate that into policy, where you centralize risk management. Centralizing risk management in a command council for 60 million people is quite frankly inhumane, because it disallows radically different people. And I'm not talking kind of culture and race or anything like that. I'm just saying that we're all radically different. Andries, me and you are very, very different. We live in different cities. Our families are different ages. We live in different suburbs. We've got different careers. We've got all, almost on almost every dimension, we are different people who have different risk priorities. I might fear the virus more than you. I might be more susceptible than you. I might, live with an elderly person with comorbidities, and that affects how I behave, and you might not.
Yeah.
So for me, the idea that you can centralize risk management decisions on something this complex is at best absurd, and at worst inhumane as far as I'm concerned. And so I think what we're trying to do at Panda is show this. We're trying to show this. So yes, we're trying to show how these models were wrong, but a level above that, we're trying to say, guys, never again, please, never again, when we're faced with complex risks, do we want to let a handful of academics scare a handful of power-hungry politicians, or encourage a bunch of power-hungry politicians into making such deeply centralized and ill-conceived policies that affect literally 60 million people, and, well, quite frankly, billions of people around the world.
But let's just clear this up, because when you say this, Russell, people will say you don't care for lives. But that's exactly the point. It's the fact that you do care for lives that you would make that point. Am I speaking on your behalf, or don't you care for lives?
I'm a cold, heartless monster, Andries.
You look it.
No, listen. This is critical, and the way I've started to explain this to people is to say, guys, the economy is a life support machine. That's what it is. It's one big life support machine. What we do, waking up in the morning, brushing our teeth, going to work, trading with people, driving here, driving there, doing things, all this stuff that encompasses our daily lives, called the economy. We don't sort of just do it as a side hobby. This is how we sustain life. Now, obviously, if you progress enough as an economy, you get beyond, just sustaining your actual life with food and shelter and so on, and you get to be able to perhaps self-actuate a little bit more into more enjoyable pleasures and hobbies, and that's great. But it doesn't take a lot to pull us back to a place where we're just trying to survive, and in a place like South Africa, where we've consumed so much capital, so much wealth over the last 10 to 20 years, we're not very far from being in a situation where there are many South Africans right on the edge. And this life support machine called the economy, if you just turn it off, Andries, you and me might be able to be okay, because our businesses maybe can keep going. Even if they fail, we've got maybe some savings in the bank. We've got, friends with some money that we can maybe draw on or help us, or we've got a network like that. There's a lot of people, though, who are right on the edge. Yeah. Right on the edge of poverty, right on the edge of poverty and death. And when you turn the economy off like this, you turn the life support machine off, you start seeing people dying. You start seeing failure, people going into malnutrition, people eating grass, like we've heard from the Eastern Cape, and plants, people scavenging for food wherever they can get it. beggars more and more coming onto the streets in desperation. So one of the things we did at Panda was to try and show how many more lives are affected and how many more lives are at risk and will be lost from draconian lockdown like we're seeing relative to something like coronavirus. And so far, we're not only been shown to be, broadly correct, but possibly we even underestimated our case, because the coronavirus in South Africa seems to be a very minor threat, all things considered. We've had 5,000 deaths out of 60 million people. Coming to the end of our winter, models predicted 350,000 deaths. We might only get as much as 15,000 deaths by the time this whole thing is over this year. And that's a big number, sure. It's a lot of people, but consider that South Africa loses 500 to 600,000 people every year to mortality. People die. This is what happens. So, yeah, I think all things considered, this has been a very, very sorry episode, and I hope we take a lesson from this. If we look for the positives, Andries, I hope we can take a lesson that we can't turn off the life support machine.
I want to ask you this question: how long? But I want to make a comment. But this is going to be the question: how long for our economy to bounce from this? Can we bounce from this, and then how long? Because there's many models. There's the bathtub model and the U model and the V model, which Trump likes apparently. But I just want to say this thing, because you mentioned, I was driving into work this morning, and 7 o'clock they've got the typical news sound bites, the 5 minutes, the headline news and so on, and we like to hear that. But I'm also frustrated by it, because the interpretation is often so again through a prism, and more often than not it's the neoliberal sort of prism which supports the government ideology on this. And I would just say this, that in the sort of 1980s or 90s, they would say that a romantic comedy, you can't make it more than 90 minutes, right? Because that's the attention span that people have. They have a 90-minute attention, and that's that, and then, but if it's a drama, you can push it to 115 minutes, 100, 1 hour 45 for a movie. That's sort of the attention span of people. And then, you had movies like, I think Schindler's List was quite a long one. It was approaching 3 hours, and Saving Private Ryan was also a very long movie, and so on. And so people could do that, but only if it was a real blockbuster, with a really sensitive theme and so on. And then sort of, in 2010, we started binge watching series, and we saw that we could go through the whole weekend. I may have done that. There was one of the first series was something called 24. I love that series. So Karen and I would actually watch the thing for, like a whole Saturday, literally. I mean, if the kids were away, we would just watch the whole, So 24 hours of watching a series, or 12 hours, whatever. But here's the thing: the attention span of the modern human is no different, And we have a much longer attention span, and that's why I think this type of discussion is important, where we can really get to the bottom of stuff, where we can really get to what is it that drives things fundamentally, and then start only applying on a sort of a practical level. So we'll start applying now, but I think it's important to go deep and then go to practical, and so I appreciate that from you. But just to say to all the people tuned in, that's going to be the format going forward, because we really can't afford the naivety of soundbite decision making. We have to understand, what makes a model work, what doesn't make a model, what are the real trade-offs, because in any policy decision, there are massive trade-offs, and here we're seeing it going horribly wrong. So more power to you with Panda, and keep going, because that's amazing work, and we need that message strong. So whatever we can do to support, because
thanks,
you're clearly right. And you got the best minds in the country, to work on that, or some of the best. I mean, there's a lot of really talented people in South Africa, which is always a good thing. But you got the right crowd. I mean, just reading through who's on board, it's a number of scientists, all sorts of foundational
Yeah,
stuff.
and I think there's some good people involved with Panda. It's been a joy to be a part of. We're not right about everything, and we certainly can't be. And I suppose in some articles we've taken a bit of a confrontational tone, but not because we're trying to play a sort of intellectual one-upmanship kind of game.
Yeah.
We genuinely think that the political, if you like, the political philosophy behind this whole thing is rotten. It's rotten and it's unjust. To be able to think that a handful of people can build abstractions about the future on the basis of assumptions, and then to think that that is the basis for a policy where you're not just telling people, don't drive faster than 80 kilometers an hour. You're telling people they have to stay at home. They cannot go and trade to earn a living. They cannot actually participate in life. You're using these models to turn off the life support machine, which is the economy. The economy is a life support machine.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we get a bit angry. That's why we get a bit angry at this process. It's not about necessarily who's right or wrong about how many deaths are going to happen in the Eastern Cape, in the next few weeks.
No.
It's about saying, do we believe in a society where risk management happens at a decentralized level, where individuals, families, companies, communities make these decisions? Or do we believe in a society where one man on a command council makes these decisions? Societies that go for the command council route were littered with corpses in the 20th century. Yeah. It's a terrible political philosophy that's driving the underlying rationale for what we're seeing here.
I'll give you two quick examples. Just in the beginning of the lockdown, my favorite little trip was to the butchery every day. I would literally go once a day because, we could get out and that was a good excuse. So I would go to the butchery. But just before that, I sort of went to the butchery one day and the whole thing hadn't kicked in yet properly. And they placed a hand sanitizer in front at the butchery and sort of said, can you sanitize your hands? So I'm walking in, I'm in thought, and I'm sorry to say, but I said to the guy, no, I don't want you to spray that stuff on my hands because I don't like it. It feels a bit strange, doesn't it? So I sort of say no. I say no, thank you, and I walk into the into the butchery. From behind the counter, the owner of the butchery shouts at me. He says, "Sir, this is a green zone. We are completely bio, safe and all of that. You have to sanitize." So I'm like, gee, sorry, turn around, sanitize my hands, walk in and, do my stuff. He then walks over to me and he says, hey, sorry about that, but, this is my business, man. And I thought, that's awesome because that is self-regulation. That's someone acting on his own behalf whilst, doing the right thing. And I thought that that's a good example of how regulation should be compared to another friend of mine, who's passed away because he had a severe bout of pneumonia. They tested him for COVID. He did not have COVID. And accordingly, the hospital said to him, you can't come into hospital because you're going to get COVID. This was about 2 weeks ago. So he passed away.
No, that's tragic. And I think we're going to hear many, many stories of the irrationality of the fear, but also the regulations. And I think there's going to be many instances, unfortunately, I think there already has been, and there are going to be more instances where this kind of thing happens. And what you've done is you've removed agency, you've removed decision-making ability from people. It's an incredibly sort of emasculating and disenfranchising process. It is how tyranny works. We've had a 4-month trial of communism. That's what this is.
It's not fun, is it?
It's not fun. No, it's not fun. We want to return the product. No, let's return the product. We don't want it.
Back to same.
So, but you know, so for me, again, just to reiterate, it's less about actual modeling. It's less about actual predictions. It's building a policy structure, and it's the political philosophy that says a few academics who are so-called experts will tell us how to manage risk. And it's a spectacular, as far as I'm concerned, it's turning into a spectacular failure.
But it's also a failure of debate, because here we have another set of I would like to contain more qualified people with more real life experience. I mean, you've got 3-4 actuaries on Panda who really understand mortality and who really understand dread disease, and you know, that's their life. And they all agree on a certain model. So at least there should have been a proper debate, at the very least, I would say. But nevertheless, we carry on about the same thing. Let's move on. I'd like to ask you about, how do we recover? You know, let's assume by the end of August, you know, the sort of sanity prevails, and you know, the model starts showing that it would never actually reach anywhere near, as you are saying. Let's say we hitting a 15,000 death in South Africa, which is tragic, but you know, obviously not anywhere near as bad as what we predicted. And we are seeing that most people are infected, and hopefully we get a vaccine, and so life goes on. What then? How long does it take, and what do we need for a full recovery? And is it possible, or did we break the machine now?
I think there's probably at this stage, well, there's a few, but let's say there's 2 key dimensions to this. The one is how decisively we can genuinely come out of lockdown. I'm not that optimistic about that. So, I mean, I think lockdown will de facto gradually end. I think that's sort of happening already. But as long as you have government sticking to a particular line about risk and fear and lockdown, and actually prosecuting people for breaches of lockdown, it's going to retard economic activity. As long as you require excessive health and safety protocols, you know, as long as the state requires all these things, it's just going to retard recovery. So I think a big factor is the political psychology of ending lockdown. Do the politicians just end it? Do they retain some pride and sort of slowly end it? To what extent does some of the renewed fears happening overseas, where there's talk of renewed lockdowns, but in some countries, to what extent does that translate into the domestic politics, who, bear in mind, are very, very power hungry politicians? You know, our local politicians are enjoying the ability to centralize power. We saw that in the worst of the lockdown. Minister Ibrahim Patel was probably the poster child of this. Drafting full-on communist type regulations for the buying of clothes, you know, and various things. This has been a kind of a dream for the central planners. So that's one sort of scenario dimension, is how quickly do we get out of this lockdown? And I would say unfortunately it probably lingers through the course of August, maybe even September. I don't know that flights are going to open up very quickly. So there's definitely a drag in that sense. The second dimension is ANC, overarching ANC policy embedded in global policy. Global economic policy is shifting leftward. It's shifting towards more controls on energy, on money, you know, on banking, on mobility, travel. There's this real clampdown that sort of transcends just coronavirus. I think it goes into a kind of leftist shift globally, a centralizing sort of ethic globally. And we know that our own government runs disastrous policies for this economy. And there's been no indication through lockdown, I'm afraid to say, that there's any desire to liberalize this economy. If anything, There's talk of clinging on to, South African Airways as a state-owned enterprise. There's talk of clinging on to Eskom. We still haven't got proper energy sector deregulation. There's just so many dimensions across which the ANC is just not making any progress from a policy perspective. And I think all of this, Andries, unfortunately, is making people very, very despondent. It's making investors very, very nervous of South Africa. And it's making South Africans very despondent about the country in which they live. And this is encouraging, I think it's going to encourage, at least for a while, a renewed wave of emigration once some restrictions on travel do actually lift. So for me, the recovery trajectory here is not great. And I think the data overseas is just about corroborating that. I mean, China is a mixed bag. Some of the early Chinese data when they ended their lockdown, recovered. Some of it hasn't recovered that well. It's quite a mixed bag. The UK, April, May, June data is looking very poor. So unfortunately, we're going to lose a whole lot in the lockdown. Yes, we're going to claw some of that back quickly. That's the V portion, but the V doesn't get up to where you were. It gets maybe 10% of where you were, 90% of where you were. So maybe 10% down, or 85% of where you were, 15% down. So there's my sense is there'll be a new normal, if you like, a new sort of plane at which the economy operates that lasts for quite a while. It's going to be a lot lower than where we started, unfortunately. There's a few countervailing forces to that which we can get into.
The economist coined it as the 90% economy, and I think that sort of corroborates what you're saying. We've got a very interesting question here from Isabella, who asked, what are your thoughts on the relationship between FDI, GDP, and investment and interest rate under the current circumstances? With lower interest rates, will South Africa be able to attract FDI and return an increase on GDP? Or will this cause the economy to grow again? I think that's a great question, especially now that we're seeing a lower interest rate cycle, probably extending for a little bit. So what's your views on that? I'll add to Isabella's question, and that is that I believe that it's not just about capital these days. It's about connected capital. It's about capital that actually has access to innovation. Now, you mentioned about the pricing mechanism and how sort of it punches you on the nose, but that causes you to try again, to fail forward, to innovate, really. So, and South Africa needs to, I believe, innovate out of this current thing that we were in way before lockdown. I think, we've been in a tragic economic state for the past sort of 5 years at least, probably longer. But Isabella's question is, is there going to be inflow because the interest rates are now not so attractive?
Yeah. So look, I think South Africa's problems are so much deeper than an interest rate cycle. Yeah. Interest rate cuts obviously on fixed income products diminish the attractiveness of holding South African, fixed income assets, rand assets. You get less interest rate compensation for the currency risk that you're taking.
Exactly. Yeah.
Some might say, well, rate cuts can kind of spur a little bit of a borrowing cycle, which can create growth, but that's not really true, and it's certainly not any kind of sustainable long-term growth that a proper investor would pile FDI into the country for. No, what investors are looking for is a 10 to 30 year vision of South Africa that's viable, that's positive. That's the bottom line. And when you look at a government that makes utterly irrational decisions. Now, in fairness, most of the world are making irrational decisions at the moment, but we seem to have a penchant for really excelling at irrational policy in South Africa. I mean, I don't think there's any country in the world that's banned cigarettes and alcohol and all the rest of it, and permanent restaurant bans and all this kind of stuff. So I think that investors are looking at the underlying structure of South Africa and going, is this country a winner, in the next 20 years.
Yeah.
It's very hard to see South Africa winning in the next 20 years. Now I think that there are we can debate that because that's a big future call. What turns the ship around in South Africa? Trends don't always last forever. Okay. So maybe there's some sort of trend shifting thing that's got to go on. Well, I mean, I can say with a fairly high degree of confidence that South Africa's political order would have to be radically shaken up. South Africa under an ANC EFF type stewardship is only going one way, and that's down.
But why do you say that? Because the EFF is looking at. I don't want to get into politics actually, but I mean they have at least a different. They as far left, but maybe they not as corrupt. Maybe they don't, run state-owned enterprises into the ground. I don't know.
I think that I think what we have on that left side of the spectrum, we have the ANC, which straddles kind of center left to far left, and then the EFF, which is basically far left. And the EFF could be a kingmaker in the next election. It's not even clear that the ANC would accept defeat in an election. It's never been tested. They've won handsomely since 1994, so we've never tested their true democratic kind of kudos. So look, I mean, we don't have to get into all the nitty gritty of politics, but I think it's time for South Africans to appraise South Africa's risks at the most realistic and fundamental levels. A few interest rate cuts or hikes is not going to cut it. A nice speech by the president is not going to cut it. We have got a country in major fiscal problem. We've got a country that's bled productive skills for 20 years due to immigration. We've got a country that fails to attract capital because of the policies that it encumbers that capital with. It's much more deep-rooted stuff than a few cyclical dynamics. So for example, we're seeing metals prices globally starting to go up. Silver's going up, gold's at $1,800. It's very plausible that gold's at $2,500, $3,000 in the next year or two. This is a plausible scenario. So South Africa is going to benefit from a commodity cycle. If this commodity cycle continues and iron ore prices and copper and various other prices keep going up, South Africa will reap some of that tailwind. Okay. But that is a fleeting kind of cyclical dimension underneath or sitting on top of an underlying structure that's deteriorating significantly. And unfortunately, this lockdown has been particularly devastating because it's caused households and businesses to draw down on very, very precious savings and capital, which means restarting the economy is going to be very difficult because most entrepreneurs don't realize this. You'll know this well, Andries, but it takes money to restart production, right? You got to buy new product. You got to reinvest. You actually need working capital. It costs money to seed a production process again and to hire the staff back and to get that whole thing going again. Well, we've just diminished our savings in the last 3 months, 4 months, and are continuing to do so. So it's quite a pessimistic picture that I'm painting, but I think the constructive part of this is focus on the right things and advocate for the real changes. Don't tell me that to fix South Africa. And I'm not saying this, I'm not implying this of the person who's asking the question at all. I'm just saying some people are saying, if we cut rates, to zero and print money, that's going to sort out the country. I mean, obviously not only is that economically wrong, but even if it was kind of economically right, there's way deeper problems around ideology, around policy, around how this country's constituted. So I just want to encourage people that when we talk about a proper, sustainable recovery in this country, that we are thinking very, very realistically and clearly about the underlying dynamics of that recovery.
But Russell, surely, the conversation we're now having, this conversation is being had everywhere in the country at the moment. This is not a new conversation. This is not like, we are now at the edge of independent thought here. I think this is being had from Khayelitsha to, Kroonstad. It's everywhere. And the reason is because people fundamentally understand that if I am not able to do something, if I'm not able to do that sacred calling of work, that thing which provides me sustenance, and effectively keeps me sane, because that's a very, very important cofactor of just working, then something is horribly wrong. But I think the interesting thing, and in a South African context, I think one of the things which makes us special is the fact that there's a big portion of South Africa that remains adaptable. There's a big portion of South Africa that remains optimistic. There's a big portion of the South African psyche that says things are possible. And that's what always attracts me to us as a country, compared to, let's say, some of the European countries where everything is done. It's not possible. They're so, stuck in their ways that they can't think, often it seems that way. And that's a gross generalization, I understand. But what I mean to say is that what's happening is, in terms of a mega trend, so we are seeing as a mega trend, I would say globally, we're seeing that there's a proper class understanding at the moment that, geez, this political class is problematic.
Yeah.
In America at the moment, they split down the middle. You've got Republicans and Democrats, and people are almost saying on the ground level, what is this all about, Because what do they believe? Are they different? Or in South Africa, I think what we're seeing is that politicians are problematic, especially this crop. I don't think that we've seen a lot of, we don't have a lot of confidence in the amount of skill that we've seen in them. I think that's fair to say, from the sort of double speak notices that they've put out, across the board. But the other mega trend is that technology is disrupting, and it is looking at the distributed system of trust. The blockchain being the most important one that we can see. But it's not just blockchain. It is the fact that data centers are decentralized. It's the fact that services are running from anywhere in the world and can do things on an individual level. Now, that's also scary, but it's also fantastic, in that it gives us an opportunity to self-organize in a way that the world's never seen. So don't you think that South Africa has an opportunity in this space, because we may actually just move away from the centralist thinking a lot quicker than some of the other counterparts, because it's hit us this hard, because the lockdown was this hard. We had the #1 lockdown regulation in terms of, I think we were first in the world. Ours was the toughest, and yet our numbers are not even close. Will there not be a sort of a rush towards another trend?
No, I think, Andries, what you've articulated there is the good case scenario. That is the hope, that amidst very obvious state failure, and when that state failure has been made manifest, it actually encourages more and more people into thinking, hang on a minute, maybe the fundamental inequality is not rich versus poor, or white versus black, but actually it's a parasitic ruling class and everyone else. It's a minority of very parasitic rulers and everyone else. And I actually think that there's a lot of people starting to understand that, this economy is on its knees. It's spared no one really, except for public servants who are on full pay, where there have been no job losses. This is astonishing. We've got 3 million public servants out of 60 million people, who have basically not experienced any problems whatsoever through these last 4 months. They're just continuing to live life. How are we paying them? We're borrowing nearly 800 billion rand this year. On behalf of whom? on behalf of your children and my children and your grandchildren and my grandchildren. It's a gravely unjust situation, and I think it's really important for us to articulate that injustice, not so that we dwell on it in sadness, but so that we react and we say, you know what, this can't go on, and that we've got to start pivoting to better solutions. Now, I just want to add to this by saying that I think one of the reasons why we're seeing so much turmoil in the world is because of the subversiveness of technology. It's precisely because technology is subverting centralized authorities and centralized powers that those powers are now reacting. Right. So, for example, the big complaint about fake news, I think it's an erroneous complaint. I think it's a complaint mainly by legacy media, because they're actually watching their competitive advantage be destroyed by decentralized information provision. Now, sure, is there lots of nonsense on the internet? I mean, of course. But the counter to that is that the internet is basically a myth-busting machine. It's a fake news-busting machine. You can't get away with posting nonsense easily on the internet. So
it's self-regulating, absolutely.
Yeah. And we're starting to see the same thing now in finance, in currencies. Yes, cryptography. Yes, the ability to have distributed, maybe even peer-to-peer kind of lending mechanisms or capital markets. You start to, and it's not going to happen overnight, but you're starting to subvert that whole intermediation system. You're starting to disintermediate that financial system. Right. I mean, that is hugely subversive. And so, I mean, the people who've been benefiting from that system, and this is not some conspiracy. This is just a whole lot of people who benefit from that system. Most of them are very nice people, but people who benefit from that system as it currently exists are going to resist the change. They're going to try and use compliance and regulation to maintain the status quo. As you get this pushback from, it's led by not only technology. I mean, technology is the tool, but the underlying driver of it is a desire for greater autonomy, for greater flexibility, for better decision making, all these kinds of things. So to me, that's what the next 10 years at least is about, if not more, is this turmoil. And I think we headlined today's session something about innovation and sort of parasitism or wealth destruction. But that really is what's going on. It's this idea of technology allowing us to disintermediate the state, at least parts of the state, to disintermediate parts of the financial institution, to disintermediate various institutions. And I suppose we even saw this a little bit with how maybe the Catholic Church reacted in Reformation. There was a disintermediation that was kind of going on. If I had to use a sort of faith analogy, and it creates a lot of turmoil. It creates a lot of conflict and strife when people are being dislodged from particular positions. And so I think
I never thought of the Protestant Reformation as a disintermediation of the priestly class, but you're absolutely right.
No, it's exactly what it was. It's exactly what it was. Yeah. So I think that your optimism on this is probably well founded. It's not a guarantee, or at least let me say this: from here to the vision that you're talking about, Andries, let's make no mistake about this. There's a lot of hard work. There's a lot of volatility. There's a lot of potentially bad things to happen. Maybe a lot more loss of freedom before we gain the freedom back. I just don't want to pretend that I believe that it's going to be this wonderful technological utopia just around the corner. I think we must use this time of state imposition, of the imposition of state power and centralized power, to recognize the importance of resisting it, and then using the right tools from a technology perspective to do that. That's just got to be the mind frame, and we I guess move forward in the hope that if we just diligently, slowly but surely seek to protect ourselves from state predation and to fortify ourselves against these trends, these negative trends, and if enough people start doing that, then the state starts to become more impotent and kind of has to fall in line with a new social and cultural kind of direction.
Right.
That's the hope. But between here and there, let's not fool ourselves into thinking that governments and central planners and transnational organizations like the World Health Organizations and various groups are just going to kind of lie down and let the little guy win easily. I think it's going to come it's going to be a fight.
Those are worrying statements, but I can't fault you on it. But I think from where we are in South Africa is one of the benefits we have is that our state machinery is not functioning very well, and so I think that that's maybe one of the things that we have going for us. So it's a big machinery, but we've now seen that I think Kieswetter was on, and SARS is trying to fix itself. I think SARS is in for a very rough ride. We've seen some data come out of some of our trading partners as a company. Some of the big banks are going to report massively lower revenue streams to SARS than what they thought, and that would further, I believe, make them ineffective. We've also heard that, let me not speak about SARS too much, but and that was one of the pillars of the state machinery that was working quite well, one have to say. But the rest of them are not working so well, the army included. And that sort of, I think, libertarian thought is that we want a state, because some of the questions are, well, what is the role of the state then in a situation like we are finding ourselves in, and are we advocating for no state? And I think maybe it came across that way, but I don't think that that's the idea. I think it's important to have people that are representative of these smaller communities, of these smaller businesses, of these smaller families, of these small units that are representative of what's actually happening on the ground, to assist in setting the way in which we work together. In other words, to make good governance, good laws, and enforce those laws in the form of good and honest courts, which we still have. I think one of the major things we have going for us in South Africa is the fact that we have Mogoeng, who I'm a massive fan of. I think he's just a wonderful person who's standing by his beliefs, under severe pressure from time to time. We can be very thankful for him, and others, So are we saying no government, or are we saying government light? I think that's...
Yeah, look, I mean, the state debate is an age-old debate. I think it's fair to say that, if you look across the span of human history, the existence of a sovereign of some kind, is pretty much inevitable. Now, that might be at a very small scale if you're talking about some sort of prince or some sort of landowner or landlord, or it might be at a bigger level if you're talking about a monarch or a modern state. I think at the end of the day, society has to organize itself. The private sphere is important, but it's not the only sphere. And I think we can all agree with that. There is a public sphere, and there is a public domain, and there's a domain, and we need that public domain to be peaceful, to be orderly. And when it is, society flourishes. The individual domain, the private sphere, then can flourish. The private sphere doesn't really flourish well without a safe, good, attractive, peaceful public sphere. So to the degree that a government is tasked with creating a safe and peaceful public sphere, that's for me what its role is. Yeah. That's for me the appropriate role of a civil authority, let's say. We've gone miles miles beyond that in modern times, not just in South Africa, but everywhere. Whether you're talking about central banking, whether you're talking about regulations governing the environment, what you can wear, you know, what kind of food you can import, the packaging standards. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on and on. Governments are in an egregious and serious state of overreach, of mission creep beyond all kind of rationality. So we can debate one day whether we need a state or not. Let's just first agree that governments are obscenely overstretched and out of their jurisdiction. And we need somehow. Now I don't have great answers for this, but somehow we need to roll that back. I don't think the answer is vote better or vote harder or vote more. I have a feeling the answer may lie outside of conventional politics. And I think what I'm saying by that is alluding to a little bit about what you spoke about, Andries. That we have increasingly interesting and powerful technological tools. We also have the ability to build what we might call parallel institutions that don't originate and find their life source in the state. And I think it's in this sort of realm where I use this, I used this term the other day with you, where we might talk about innovative political technology, where we start thinking about alternative ways of organizing society and organizing the public domain. I mean, the problem hasn't changed. The problem remains fairly simple. We want a peaceful public domain in order to live and prosper in. The idea is to bring to bear political technology, and that requires actual technological tools, but it also requires innovative thinking about how best a society is organized. How does peace arise in a society? How do you achieve peace, for example, amongst very different types of people, different ethnic groups, different languages, different cultures? How do we structure a system that allows those people to live peacefully together, to trade, to interact, to self-determine as well, to pursue their own cultural, ideals and goals? These are major challenges that no one seems to be trying to answer in the conventional political realm. And I think they're probably only going to be answered in some kind of alternative political realm where we're thinking of parallel institutions, non-state institutions, non-state, but not non-governance, just non-state forms of organizing the public domain. This might sound a little bit theoretical and ethereal, but we've got real world examples of where this is taking place. In South Africa, for example, and I would use the example of a group like Sakeliga, Business League, which is run by Piet Leroux, and which is a business community that is building an institutional framework within which businesses can trade, interact, share resources, compete, maybe even conduct exchange from a currency perspective down the line. So I think that there are things underway, and I think more and more we've got to think in this kind of direction, because I think it's probably true to say that the conventional political order is so broken that it's probably not fixable. It's not even desirable to try and fix it from within. I think it basically needs to be replaced at some point, not in some sort of revolutionary sense, but in hopefully a kind of maybe more gradual and more rational, through a gradual and rational process that gets replaced down the line. This is how we have to be thinking about the political problem.
the most obvious example of that, and I'm aware that we're over our time, but I'm enjoying the conversation. I see that our attendees haven't really dropped off, so if you're good to go, I'm going to give it another 10 minutes or so, Russell. But I think for me, the best example of that is, why do I need the state to tell me that I'm alive, by issuing me a birth certificate or a death certificate? Surely Facebook is a lot better to judge whether I'm still active, and whatever other profile I'm using, or maybe my phone record is a lot. So there's many ways through very simple robot AI that can tell you whether you're alive or dead, and it's probably a lot more, robust than the old death certificate, which is so kind of, we don't really need that department, do we? And so what I'm saying is that there's a lot of government departments that we can sort of start closing down. So for instance, we all know we can close SAA down. We all think that we should really change ESCOM into something that's working. So, so that's
I mean, we already know that. I mean, let's just say that given that you have a state and given that you have a country, you need some sort of official stamp of citizenship.
Yeah.
We already know that you can outsource that to banks or to specialized businesses at a fraction of the cost. I mean, you could even figure out a way that those businesses would do it without being any cost to the state or to the fiscus.
Yeah.
We know, for example, that we don't need a Department of Sport. We don't need someone to tell us how we can play sport, and we certainly don't want to be funding. We certainly don't want to be funding out of taxpayers' money. Sports that people can do on their own when we have a high poverty rate, and we've still got pit latrines in half the country. I don't think we should be funding sport. We should get rid of a department like that. There's many such examples where.
Mm-hmm.
But the thing is why do those things exist? And they exist because they're a gravy train. They exist because they're an employment creator for this kind of parasitic class. And I think, and that's precisely why I think prospects for reform are very, very thin in the conventional sense. And I think it's about parallel institution creation, because the people who are benefiting from the current system aren't going to want to change it voluntarily. They're not going to care about a good argument about how much more efficient things can be. What they're going to look at is and say, well, hang on, if you close the Department of Sport, we lose 10,000 jobs. If you close the Home Affairs Department, we lose, 30,000 jobs. However many people work at Home Affairs. So, if you privatize energy and you make energy production way more efficient, we maybe only need 20,000 people working in, employed in the energy sector in the whole country. I mean, maybe a lot more, I don't know. But the point is, there would be, at least initially, a lot of job losses. So
there'd be a price.
Yeah, and this is the realistic barrier to our utopian dreams being realized. And that's why I think what the conversation we're having, Andries, is actually not a utopian one. We're saying, listen, this is not going to fix itself anytime soon. And you know what? You said earlier that a lot of what we're talking about here is sort of not necessarily innovative thinking. I mean, some of it, of course, is, and I know you would agree, but let me just sort of say that the idea that our problems are so much deeper than get a better president or get a, vote harder next time,
Yeah, vote for the DA.
That's actually a novel idea. Most South Africans, certainly for a long time, maybe this is now changing, and certainly if you engage with a lot of corporate South Africa, you get very shallow thinking on this stuff, very shallow thinking on the depth of the problem. The degree to which people believe that Cyril Ramaphosa was going to turn the ship around speaks to that level of naivety about just how fundamental and how deep rooted South Africa's problems are. So I think just to quickly finish that thought, I think if we're going to add value here, and we are. I think to the extent that we're adding value, it's stop placing false hopes in superficial change. One's got to work at a much more strategic and deeper level.
I think one of the people on the call, Hardness, just reminded us that it seems like the taxi industry is leading the fight against the economic lockdown. Now, that's exactly what you've just described, because they're a parallel institution providing a service that government is absolutely failing at. Okay.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's not a lot of people probably on this call who like the taxi industry. I think some of their methods are disgusting, and we've all been cut off by taxis, and you know, there's a whole bunch of thuggery and probably a mafia.
But they also take millions and millions of people to work every day. Every day. You know, so it's a fantastic industry.
And it's completely a parallel industry. And now that government has tried to impose a lockdown on them, saying, you know, you can't drive your taxis this way, and you have to drive with the windows open, because somehow that's going to keep corona. I mean, it's just ridiculous. It's just crazy. It's like you have to. It's in the middle of the winter. Do you want people to die of pneumonia or corona, which will? It's in the taxi. Why open the? I mean, it's just crazy.
I think what you've seen with the taxi pushback, though,
yeah,
is an example of the fact that pushback tends to only come at the point of desperation. Unfortunately, as human beings, we kind of only react when we're forced to. Maybe that's also a good thing about humans. We don't just react to everything. But if you think of the taxis, these are not businesses that are in the high echelon formal sector of the economy. I mean, it's much more of a kind of, I mean, it's formal as well, but it's also informal. And it's a lot of the taxi industry is very marginal. Fuel prices are high. It's a tough industry.
Yeah,
okay. A lockdown brings an industry like that to its knees. And it brings the customers of the taxis, it brings them to their knees. So the taxis would have been getting demands from their customers. Listen, we can't afford not to go to work. You know, our children don't have food in their stomachs. If I can't get food in my children's stomachs, I'm going to be disobeying lockdown laws quickly, you know, because that's just an intolerable situation. So what you see with big listed formal corporate South Africa is everything's kind of still okay. You know, they're very dominant positions, money's coming in, maybe they retrench a bit, but it's kind of holding together. And it's almost like until you start seeing that sector, that sort of big, large listed formal sector falling over in a bad way, it's only then, unfortunately, that you're going to get them responding. Like you're seeing with the restaurants today. The restaurants are now on their knees, you know, so they're finally saying enough's enough. And I would love to see restaurants starting to actually defy these lockdowns and these alcohol bans in a coordinated fashion. You know, 20,000, I don't know how many restaurants there are, but let's say 10,000 restaurants at a time or 5,000 restaurants at a time. Just do it. So, but the point is, it comes from a place of desperation, and maybe there's a lesson in that, which is that the more desperate things get, as horrible as it is, it forces people into a different paradigm. It forces us into a paradigm of saying, you know what, it's time for real solutions. No more pretending that Cyril Ramaphosa is going to be the game changer. No more pretending that, you know, one more good court decision is going to turn the tide. You know, it's not. That's not true. It's about actually building proper institutions that give us a peaceful, stable public domain and private sphere from which we can then produce wealth and flourish and be happy. And that stuff is very, very deep rooted and is going to take a lot more effort. So the hard news here is that nothing's going to come easy in the next 10 years. If we're going to get through this, it's going to be a lot of hard work, which some people are already putting in. And I would encourage people to look for where that hard work is being done to mitigate through technology, through cryptocurrency, through parallel institution building, guys like Sakeliga, and there's numerous other organizations. This is where, for me, some hope of restoration is starting to brew. And I really hope that you're right about the technological tools that we're creating that can help us sidestep some of the worst of this. I wrote a book about hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe didn't have any other options other than to use their currency. But just 10 years later, we have a well-developed cryptocurrency world. We have technologies that allow even the trading of foreign currencies, normal foreign currencies, in much easier ways. So it's not obvious that it's even easy to create a hyperinflation in Rand without people quite quickly transitioning into some other kind of currency system. Again, though, provided the banks are either willing to do that or there's some sort of disruption of the banking system. So this is all quite exciting. It's quite daunting. There's a lot of work to be done. I guess I would just say finally, Andries, with all this macro gloom around, another thing I've been thinking the last few months is, the antidote to a bad macro story is a good micro story. We need to be cultivating good micro stories, cultivating family, cultivating community, cultivating businesses, working on projects, building solutions, coming up with solutions to problems at a micro level. And I think if we put our focus there, we'll probably all start to see that the world's not that bad, actually. A lot of the headlines and a lot of the social media and a lot of the bombardment of the macro story can get you down. And it's to try maybe even purposefully put some of that out, not ignore it, know what the threats are, but then get focused on building some kind of solution. And what that means, different things for different people. Some people it means emigrate. Some people it means stay and build and fix and cultivate relationships or whatever it might be. So I think in a gloomy overall story, I think that's all we have. And actually, I think that's probably, in any case, this solution is focusing, a million people focusing on good micro stories becomes a good macro story.
I think that's fantastic advice, and I think that that's certainly what our organization is doing, and I think that that's what your organization is doing. I know that that's what your organization is doing, and we're doing it along fundamental lines of adding value to our customers, adding value to internal lives, and for that value, there's always room. There has to be, So, final question: since you're an advisor around asset allocation, give us a tip. Where would you allocate assets at the moment? Is it gold? I mean, is it going to 3,000? I spoke to a CEO of one of the big mines the other day, and he assured me that it was. He was speaking his own book, but I think there's good reason to think that there's a lot left in the old relic.
Well, look, let me just say that when you're in a world of considerable political turmoil, not just internally within countries, which we're seeing, but also between countries, between superpowers. When you're in a world where the current monetary order, is probably getting to the end of its full term, getting to the end of its sell-by date. You start throwing these things into the mix. You have the recipe for a world of what I call a world of scarcity. So you have periods of progress and you have periods of scarcity. Usually these are man-made and man-contrived. I think that left alone under good, healthy political systems, we'd probably almost always just have periods of progress. But we do have these periods of decline and scarcity, and these do tend to be periods of inflation. Commodity price inflation, scarcity of resources, countries hoarding commodities because the global landscape is very uncertain. Trade routes get disrupted. Shipping lanes are maybe not as safe and peaceful as they once were. So you stock up while you can on stockpiles of oil and copper and iron ore and all the basic things that we need. And of course, gold tends to do well in these environments because it's a financial asset that is essentially the reciprocal or the converse, the inverse, of confidence in central banks and the financial system itself. Whenever there is a lack of confidence in the monetary order and the financial system itself, gold does well. And of course, in a time like this, I think you've also got heightened risk of conflict. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean hot wars, possibly actual hot wars, physical wars between major powers are maybe actually a thing of the past. Maybe I speak too soon. But certainly the nuclear deterrent is a big deal now, such that I think this goes into more cyber warfare, goes into more kind of economic warfare, which, it all amounts to the same thing. If you put sanctions on a country and they can't import something, I mean, that's what happens in war. It's very difficult to import things. So this all contributes to scarcity. If a country is really struggling to import something, they're going to be willing to pay more for it. They're going to be willing to try and get it through alternative channels, through illegal channels. So you get the rise of a kind of global black market in numerous commodities, but you pay a premium for that. So I think one of the strategic insights here maybe is that we're moving into a world of scarcity. We're probably already in that world. I think we've been there for some time, but we're moving there more and more. And that is seemingly at this stage, manifesting in commodity prices. Yes, they collapsed through coronavirus, but that was a very, very, kind of specific threat where demand just fell off a cliff. But as that demand slowly comes back, these supply constraints, these frictions that we're creating in the global system now are actually, I think, going to start mattering more and start actually raising prices. So from an asset allocation perspective, you want to be saying, what are the kinds of assets that don't do well during inflation, and what are the kind of assets that do well during inflation, during a kind of long-term inflation period, or a period where inflation is a problem. And the kinds of things that don't do well are bonds. Bonds don't like inflation. They like deflation or disinflation. In terms of stock markets, obviously commodity producers, miners are always going to like inflation. Some retailers can do well during inflation because they can pass those markups on through to their customers if they've got pricing power. But the kinds of things that are likely to struggle in an inflationary world are, technology stocks like we've seen in the US, which have done so well in the last 10 years and continue to go up. But as you move into an inflationary world, that can really change. So you start favoring more kind of tangible value, utilities, materials, basic consumer goods, commodities. You move away from bonds. You also want to start thinking about shifting from developed markets towards emerging markets. And there's potentially some good story there for South Africa. If we move into an inflationary world, we're going to struggle on a number of dimensions in that world. But one dimension that will benefit us is commodity price inflation. If gold goes up to $3,000-$4,000 in the next few years, and most commodities are a lot higher in that world, South Africa will feel it. It'll feel some sort of benefit from that. Whether our politicians will try and steal that and rob the country of those benefits is a sort of another discussion, and maybe they will, but that's certainly how I would be thinking of the asset allocation landscape at the moment. Do research on whether you agree with me that we're going into an inflationary world, and do research on the kinds of things, if we do go into an inflationary world, do research on the kinds of assets that tend to benefit in that world. If you can get those answers, if you can get clarity on those two big ideas, those two big themes, are we going to get inflation and what benefits from inflation? I think you'd be well positioned in the next 5 to 10 years.
Russell, it's a pleasure. I'm going to have to cut it off, but I think there'll be around two because we didn't get to half of our agenda. You do know that. We got to about a third.
I'm very happy to, yeah, we're very happy to join you again. And I, I appreciate your viewers' patience, and it's a great honor to have people watching and listening. And I thoroughly enjoyed the conversation, Andrew. So would be, very willing to join you again for further chats about all these great things.
Okay, Russell, thank you so much. And Albert, if you can just flight that the slide of our next axiom. But very, very interesting. Our next discussion is how creativity unlocks trust. And we've spoken on axiom around the trust economy quite a few times. And Louisa Mazinter is the chief marketing officer at Cube Square Advisory, and she's one of those little micro successes that Russell spoke about. She was basically running the digitization strategy of Steinbeck, and they've had enormous successes. And so she's moved on now to Cube Square Advisory. So really looking forward to that. That'll be on the 5th of August. It's going to be a normal Axiom webinar, not on the Brink. But yeah, just to sort of finalize, Russell, thank you so much. It was awesome to meet. It was good to talk, and I think really get straight talk about some of the issues that people are not willing to go into this level of depth into. So thanks for that. I think on the whole, to all of our viewers, there's quite a few questions. I didn't want to disrupt the flow of the conversation too much, so I worked in a lot of your questions, as you could determine, but I know that there's a few that were unanswered. So hopefully we can get to those in time with further discussions. But thank you for tuning in today. And Russell, have a good one, and keep building those micro successes, and I'll join you in that. I think that's a good strategy.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Andres. I really appreciate it. Take care, everyone.